Hi everyone, I'm Cameron. Welcome to AccessibilityNYC. Sorry for the delays, we're all set up now. I just wanted to say some thank yous to start off with. Thank you to Thoughtbot for hosting us tonight. This is Thoughtbot, and they're a web and mobile development consultancy. They do design, development. If you're curious, talk to Tyson over here. He's a designer at Thoughtbot. I also want to say thank you to SSB BART for their ongoing support and sponsorship, and to all of you for joining tonight. And to Jolly and the Internet Society of New York for ongoing help with streaming and their support for the event. And Mirabai Knight, who is doing the captions today. She works with White Coat Captioning. They do all sorts of events, including technical events, and she's amazing. Thank you, Mirabai. On that note, let's get started in with Shawn. Shawn Lauriat is here. He's one of the organizers of the meetup as well, and I'll let you take it away. Thanks, guys.
Great, thanks. I'm Shawn Lauriat. So I've been a mentor for Open Scilab for the last few semesters, which I'll get into in a moment. For more introduction, day job-wise, I'm a software engineer. I lead a group of engineers at Google working on accessibility, which is kind of how I got into this, but I'll explain that one too. So Open Scilab, so I tweeted out a link to the slides in response to the tweet that our meetup group put out a while back announcing this, so anybody can follow these links. All right, that should work. Okay, so Open Scilab is a nonprofit that has been doing a collab in partnership with Parsons, the New School for Design here in New York, for I think 2 years now, a year and a half, 2 years. I think it started up in Cambridge at MIT, but so a year and a half ago, Grace, who runs Open Scilab here in New York, came and gave a talk on Open Scilab and kind of some of the projects and some of the background of where it came from, which was super cool. And so it basically is forming teams of designers and engineers and people with disabilities to accomplish a specific goal for the person with disabilities. And so she gave some talks, showed some videos of projects and that sort of thing, talked about the creation of the program. I've linked to a couple of articles here that recently went out. So one is Designing for All Abilities. This is a New York Times feature that went out from the spring semester final projects. And recently, the next phase of inclusive fashion designing for the disabled, which is a feature in Vogue. So I now have worked on a project in Vogue, which is something I never thought I would say. But I think that's badass. So at any rate, the way that it works is teams form at the very beginning. So the program is a semester long, which is not terribly long to do some of the things that these teams have accomplished. But you start off with engineers, designers, occupational therapists, and people with disabilities. So you have generally kind of one person in each category. Sometimes you have a couple engineers, sometimes you have no occupational therapist, but everybody's teamed with a person with disabilities who has a specific need. So typically, as an example, somebody might be a wheelchair user who doesn't really have rain gear that actually protects their lap or their legs or their gear, the back of the chair. That's fairly common just because raincoats weren't really made to be used in a sitting position. But there's a bunch of other projects that have happened as well. But they form into these teams. And one of the things that I really like about this program is that it's not just, okay, let's get engineers, designers, and occupational therapists together, meet a person with disabilities, and then say, okay, well go, you just wait here and we'll come back with something awesome for you in like 12 weeks or 10 weeks or 8 weeks, and not actually involve the person in the decision making at all, because a lot of times then you run into situations where you're not actually addressing the person's real issues, or you're not making something to their preference, but you're not including them at all, which is really detrimental. So the thing that's awesome with this is that the person is basically like a full-fledged team member. They take part in experimentation and prototyping and give feedback. They come up with ideas. I've seen them brainstorm things that ended up in the final projects. So it's a super collaborative effort, and everybody ends up doing kind of everything all over the board. So you have engineers learning how to sew. You have designers learning how to code. It crosses all these boundaries and everybody learns a lot, but it's pretty cool. So the next stage that happens that I am aware of, because as a mentor, I'm not there every single class. I'm there basically like 3 or 4 classes. I show up for a bit and I see where things have gone and then offer some insights or help with brainstorming. So the first place that I come in is the forming of design requirements. So this is after the team has formed. This is after they've met their client and they've talked about, what problems do you have that might be able to be solved through wardrobe or technology, and really get to meet the person and get a sense of their style and get a sense of kind of, their lives. How do they interact? How do they move around the city? What's their commute like? What do they like to do? And then they kind of take all of that information and put it, there's this brainstorming board that Grace has a fancy name for that I can never remember, but it's covered in stickies and paper arrows like crossing over each other, and there's photos all over the place. There's swatches of fabric up at the top. Some of the stickies, hey Grace. Grace is here, who leads this and can now keep me honest. So some of the stickies that are up here are showing relationships between different terms. So like some terms are chair, quad belly, leg, other things, material, body temp, weather, comfort, durability, aesthetics, and really trying to map out what the core problems are, what the core constraints are, and really trying to collect all of it into an actual mission statement for the team. And something to keep in mind is this is like when does this happen? Like week 2? Week 3 out of 10 weeks. So this is the point where like you're forming the mission and then it feels like week 10 is really far off until like 2 weeks later. So there's a lot of experimentation that happens after this. So this was an experiment that I suggested that the team do, which ended up helping them. Good. So this was a gentleman who has, some of his vertebrae are compressed, and so it ends up having, his back is not shaped kind of like my back, like it has different curvature to it, and it basically means that sitting in chairs is extremely painful, especially for a long period of time, because it just doesn't support his back in the way that it really needs to. And so the team was saying, okay, well, we need to support his back, but they didn't know how much and they didn't know where. And they also didn't know what would be painful, what would be not enough support, that sort of thing. So I advised them to just like slap together a way that they could map out his back pressure-wise. So this picture shows this just muslin taped to his back, spread over the entire thing with just a grid. And they're attaching pressure sensors. They're really cheap little components, and they're just taping that to different points. And then that all gets fed into a breadboard and then into an Arduino, and they're just taking literal measurements. They don't have to scale it. They don't have to make this like a pressure mapping product. Like this is just slapped together so they can have an idea, and they just read the numbers, and it's like, okay, 10 is not enough pressure. 100 is way too much pressure. And they just mapped out all these points, and it didn't take all that long, but it ended up kind of really interesting because they could make a literal pressure map of his back. And that meant that not only could they know what needed more pressure where or what would be too much pressure, but they didn't actually need him there to test when they were testing with different materials, because they could just measure the pressure that a given material could support. And they also took a mold of his back, so they could also do fittings of this pressure vest without him there. So they just kind of abstracted the physical requirements of like, okay, Doug, we need you to come in again, or okay, somebody needs to chase down Doug. And this way they could at least hammer out some of the details without having to kind of coordinate that, which is super important when now you're at like 6 weeks out from final. Prototyping. So this is a picture of a series of pictures, sorry. I just went through like the pictures that I had taken with all of these things, and I realized that I didn't remember where I kept them, so I found the best that I could. So this is a picture of some things that weren't the actual project itself. This was a coat for a young woman who, her arms are completely paralyzed, so putting on and taking off a coat is not easy. to say the least. And so they were making a coat that could be a lot easier to put on and off, protect when it's cold, that sort of thing. And they ended up doing a fantastic job. The time that it took for her to put on a coat went from like 4 or 5 minutes or something very long to like 1.5 minutes. I think they were aiming for like 2 minutes and they blew it away. But the prototyping here that I'll walk very gingerly toward so I can point. So on the left, there's different fabrics, and the different fabrics were important because as you're scooping your head through the neck in order to then stand up and have it drape down over you, the fabrics are super, super important, which they found out when they were prototyping with the muslins, which is just super light, super cheap fabric that you can just like create whatever patterns you want and try it on, which is awesome for sizing, but it's not awesome for how the fabric actually slides over you or how it holds its shape, that sort of thing. So they ended up looking at the fabrics a lot for the liner itself so that it was smooth enough to just slide down, but also to have the neck lining firm enough that when she would put the coat in her lap, it would hold the neck shape enough that she could just stick her head through without having to like bite it and bring it up and then try again and having it just fall over her ponytail. So this prototyping process they did super rapidly with not only the fit and the shape, but also with the fabrics, just because that was so essential. More iterating. So I brought up the more iterating because this team did so much fitting, it was astonishing. They also had fewer weeks than the other team because their client was going to a wedding and they were flying out. He was flying out when the final exam was, or the final presentations were happening. So they actually finished their project a week early, which I don't know how they did, but they did. So this iteration, something to note in the background, there's a series of mannequins. So the one in the foreground is the final project. The ones in the background are a whole bunch of different fittings. This was for a gentleman who, he didn't have any mobility from around the waist or like upper waist down, but he needed a formal jacket that he could wear. And he had one that was really, really old, really uncomfortable, because when you're in a chair, like your back is right up against the back of the chair and that can rub in unpleasant ways, it can build up sweat. Also, your arms tend to sit like this because you're in a chair. So having super straight sleeves means that it bunches up all over here and it just kind of looks like crap. Also, just the lay of his shoulders and everything was not really helpful. So they did a whole bunch of experimentation with fit. They did all kinds of modifications. They shortened the jacket so it wouldn't bunch up and removed the pockets because there's kind of not really need for that. And they used, I think they used liner underneath that would wick away the sweat, as well as some patches under here to make it a little more breathable, because he didn't have to, walk around in it and have this all open. It just needed to wick the sweat away. But the wool that they used over it kept the formal aesthetic of it. But then each of the iterations, they were going for different fabrics, different shapes, and everything like that. But because fabrics aren't super cheap, you don't need to prototype the entire jacket. You can just prototype the sleeve and that particular shoulder joint and see what works. And I think they also iterated on the collar shape, basically just for aesthetics, just to make sure that it was actually the style that he needed. Because if you go to a formal event, you don't want it to look like, something that you would never wear. Feel free to interrupt with questions or corrections for those from OpenStyleLab. Okay, more iterating. So this was a project that it was really interesting. So the woman, let's see, well, I have it written down because I can never remember it. Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, which basically means that she doesn't actually have collagen in her body, which means no ligaments, which means that every time she goes to sleep or when she's moving around, her joints tend to dislocate very, very easily. I think she does physical therapy because she works out a lot because she has to build up the muscle tone, because it's the muscle tone that actually keeps her joints together. But so she typically wears a brace, which looks really ugly in like medical equipment, and it also doesn't work great. And so this team was making a replacement that she could wear out and about, but it had to be super durable, but it also had to have, what is the term for the different places where it joins? Well, it had to have the compression, but I'm thinking for like the zippers and buckles and things, there's a term for that, and I'm spacing on it. Closures, thank you. So they had to experiment with clothing closures, specifically because when she wakes up in the morning, a lot of times her fingers are dislocated, and so she doesn't have great ability to manipulate very fine things, and it's actually a really painful process as well as frustrating. But so the important part for this was the shoulder compression, so that it would keep her shoulders in at a certain point. So she had 2 braces. There was one for each shoulder, which would kind of double up. It's also a really involved process for her to take them on and off, and she wasn't really happy with them when they were on. So they iterated. This is actually 3 of the 5 prototypes that they made. Let's see, they experimented with fabrics. So they went from a lighter lengthwise reinforced fabric to a series of firmer adjustable black straps, which ended up proving way too complicated to manage. And then finally, the black fabric result on the right, which kind of resembled the first design-wise, but with something more adjustable. So it had snaps on the front that were a lot easier for her to manage the tightness of it. So this buckle, the snap in the front would delegate how much pressure was on the shoulder, because it was actually the snap from the thing wrapping around the back. And then final projects and presentations. So these are some pictures of final projects, which are always so impressive to me, because it starts off, and like you saw a bunch of the prototypes, they were just muslin. It looked like it was made in 10 minutes, because sometimes they were. But ultimately, like, it turns into a seriously real product. It's a seriously real piece that is made with fabric that's made for whatever the cause is. So on the left here is a rain jacket that was made for a woman who uses a wheelchair, and it had kind of a modified shape so that it could cover her lap, and has a flap covering kind of the backpack that would sit on the back of the chair. This team made several things. One thing that I really had to do with this team was try to get them to focus on narrower scope. So I think they only did 3. So they did visibility at night with reflective gear, or reflective materials on glove additions. The glove additions also were made to be a lot more durable, because this woman, as she's wheeling around town, you wear through gloves like nothing, because you're just doing this all the time. And so they ended up making all of these different kind of slip-on things that you could put over gloves that were just the index finger and the thumb, basically to give only this area more support, because it was really this seam that tended to wear down the most. So they have loads of pictures of gloves of April's that were just completely worn through, and it was like a couple of weeks. And now the gloves are shot. So I think they used for one of the glove additions a combination of leather and knit Kevlar, and they moved the seam so that it wasn't here. So super, super durable material, but also something that she can trade off and put on over other gloves, or just over her hand. But also moving the seam just so that that wouldn't get the stress repeatedly on kind of the most vulnerable point. Next over, there's another rain jacket for Team Pete. Pete, who is actually a member of the Meetup group, which is awesome. So this rain jacket is super cool, because it's not only like protective and it protects the lap and everything that I mentioned for April's jacket, it also has a laser cut design in the left cuff, not completely through, it's still waterproof, but it's just so that he can see the drive watch that he has for his power chair. So that way he can see the indicator through the jacket even when he has it all on. The other cool thing is that, so Pete does have some mobility in his legs and his hips, so he can stand and walk around when the occasion calls for it. And so he needed a jacket that would work both when sitting and when standing. So this jacket, as it is right now, you can almost make it out in the picture. It's kind of cut in like this so that it just has 2 flaps going on the legs, so that way when you sit down it covers your lap. But when you stand up, you can reach in to these folds on the side and grab the fabric and pull, and there's just 2 magnets holding the rest of it in place, and when you pull it out, it flaps out to cover the entire back side of you. So it turns into like a long, like mid-thigh rain jacket. It also looks really badass, so I would love it if I could have one as well, but it's custom made. I can't. And then the last one that's here is a beautiful winter jacket. It's wool, but it was very heavily designed for the client, Team Shawn, who is also a member of the Meetup, which is super cool. There's a pattern here. So for Shawn's jacket, Shawn has cerebral palsy, but she walks with ski poles. So she has a lot of mobility, but she also moves her arms when she walks, and she relies on that heavily. And so there tends to be a lot of movement and stress on jackets up here. There tends to be like more sweat buildup in the shoulders. She also, because she needs the ski poles when she's standing, she can't stand up and put a jacket on, because she needs the support. So she puts the jacket on when she's sitting in a chair and then stands up, which with most jackets means that she tries to stand up and now she's tied to a chair. So this jacket has these flaps in the back that are kind of at an angle. So that way, when she stands up, they just kind of open up and go around the chair that she was sitting in. So it's similar to like a riding jacket for horse riding, which is where you have an entire jacket that covers all around you, but it's kind of like tails, except it goes around the front of you as well, so it's split. So that way, for the riding jacket, if you're sitting on a horse, your legs are protected and you don't have a jacket bunched up behind you on the saddle. So that was some of the inspiration for that design choice. And then there's a hood that comes out of that collar, which I didn't even notice. I mean, I knew that it was happening, but I couldn't tell that it was actually there, seeing it in person, because Shawn does a lot of public speaking, and so she really needs to have that kind of professional air about her when she's going out in public speaking, so it can't be just kind of like, here's my jacket and my hood flapping behind me. So it tucks into that collar. It rolls up very, very small and tucks into the collar, but the hood was super necessary because in addition to not being able to stand up and put a jacket on because of the need for the ski poles, you also can't hold an umbrella while you're walking around with ski poles. And so the hood was super necessary just to prevent her head from being completely soaked in the rain getting into her jacket. So there are several videos that I've linked to here. Like I said, I tweeted out a link to the slides. But I figured I could at least show one video. I have no idea if I have sound hooked up to this, but the videos are captioned. There's no sound, and I think it's hiding the captions. Okay, I'm going to cover up the captions that are down here for a moment to see if expanding the window makes it so that we can see the captions in the video, and then once the video is done playing, or I determine that that's just a no-go, then I'll put these captions back.
I've been a wheeler for 32 years, and I live and work in New York City. Living in New York City.
Stay there. All right, well, I'm not going to go back and forth and try and figure this out in front of everybody. So like I said, I linked to the slides in my tweet. There we go. So each of these 4 videos are the videos from the most recent class that like just ended and did their final presentations. The other thing that I don't know how the teams did is how they managed to put together like really nice polished videos in addition to like actually finishing their projects. But definitely check them out. It's super cool. They tell the story, they're like a couple minutes long each, so it's not a lot of time dedication, but have a look. It has like the introduction to the client, kind of the backstory of what are the challenges that this person is facing, what kind of iteration they did, what kind of prototyping happened, what challenges they hit, and ultimately building out the real thing. Team April's video ends in a super cool demo of the rain jacket, like literally in a shower. She like sticks goggles on and they're just like douse. And she said that it actually worked spectacularly. Like she and the chair were both totally dry at the end of it. Yep. Yeah, we have some of the fellows here, so mill about after I'm done chattering. And you can also ask them loads of questions. Raise hands, those who are in. There you go. But yeah, there's some really great just kind of illustrations of how the teams actually managed to get the projects together, and just some of the design choices that were made, because a lot of the point of this project is not, okay, let's create assistive technology. It's more, let's create a wearable that just looks like it was made for the person. It doesn't look like a medical device, even though it does have certain things taken into account for a person's disability. It's not the point. So like Team Marcy ended up putting together formal wear, and the point of it is to look like formal wear. It's supposed to look really nice. It's not supposed to look like a medical device. And they did a great job of it. So please check out the videos, and any questions? Cameron.
This may be for the fellows in particular, but I was wondering, was there anything that came out of this work that informed things that you might do in kind of like broader designs that are for everyone, so that people who don't have access to getting something customized might be able to still buy something off the rack that's made for anyone, but would have some considerations built in for those with disabilities or other sources of special needs?
I hope I'm answering your question. I think with a jumpsuit, I think a lot of women would relate to, it's kind of a pain in the ass to put it on and also use the bathroom. And so we created an access point for Marcy, who uses a catheter, where she doesn't have the issue where she has to take the whole thing off. We had it so that we had an access point where she would just stretch open the front and then she could use her catheter. And then if we could find other ways so that, you know, maybe for people who don't need the catheter, just so that it could become a pair of pants. And yeah, so it's very, we can do a lot of things to make it move.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I noticed in this process, Chow was our occupational therapist, was the understanding from that world being applied to fashion, which is my world, and purely just making that consideration at the beginning can create options that perhaps weren't applicable to people who are fully able-bodied, but through this process actually resulted in some unique and useful solutions.
Oh.
I think this piggybacks off his question. I see most of these are like really custom.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you speak a little bit towards
Oh, sorry.
Because we have the caption.
Okay, so I noticed that these are really custom designs for specific use cases, but I feel like some of the conditions are more widespread. They're more general, right? Are there any benefits in approaching this from a modular perspective? You see, like for like a module for this condition, a module for this condition, because then that becomes easier to approach to mass produce.
Right. Grace, I feel like you could answer that better than I could.
Yes. So we all strive for a universal design all the time, but I think for the sake of 10 weeks and 15 weeks, we're not simply there to make a product and be like, here, this is what you're going to wear, but having the experience, you're creating a space where we can discuss and have mentorship also for some of our clients with disabilities to share about their life. But eventually, after doing this for 4 years, I see there's a lot of commonalities, and those commonalities are what I hope would be considered universal design or design aspects that can be applied to products or services. So that's a long story, but they are part of a new wave, I think, of creativity. So I think we are looking towards finding more solutions that's right.
If you're going to answer more questions, it'd be helpful if you went and stood over there close to his mic.
Charlie, is this mic on?
This mic is on, but there's a lot of room noise.
Okay.
So yeah, with like Grace said, a lot of the projects had a lot commonalities. So they're pretty much every semester there has been somebody who said, okay, I'm a wheelchair user and dealing with the rain in New York City is just awful. Pretty true. So there's a lot of common threads through them. There's a lot of differences through each of the specific projects just because each person has their own very specific needs, but there's definitely a lot of overlap between things where like every single person is like, yeah, the backpack that I stick in the back of my chair also gets wet, not just me. My chair also gets wet, not just me. Even if a rain jacket is covering, my torso, and even if you get a rain jacket that's long enough that it will cover your legs, or what most people do, wear a rain jacket and then stick a garbage bag over your legs, your chair is still getting wet, your bag's still getting wet. Like these are things that happen to everybody. So like going the modular route would definitely be a good idea for handling things like that. Also just in kind of the common wear and tear for places, if like the gloves for chair users just seems kind of like this should not be that difficult to find gloves that can just withstand that. But it is. Cameron.
The focus on fashion, I guess, is interesting to me because I'm a web developer. So when I think about accessibility, I'm oftentimes thinking about it in terms of digital accessibility. And one of the guiding factors in digital accessibility is web standards and Americans with Disabilities Act as it applies to digital spaces. Is there anything like that for fashion or even for like product design, similar to like, does the ADA apply to fashion in any regard? I don't know. I think I may have a guess, but
sort of, but it tends to apply a lot more for like the stores in which they are selling clothing. And even then they don't do great at that. Especially in New York where floor space is hard, and so your aisles are all like as skinny as this pedestal. The other side of that is there are some guidelines for things like this, but it tends to be a lot more on the medical side. So if any of these teams were to try to market their projects as a medical device, there are all kinds of laws about that. But it's more for the red tape and the testing that has to go through in order for it to be approved as like an insurance whatever they call it, they have like a code for that specific thing, which is also because of that whole process, typically why these like typically really unattractive and kind of okay medical devices, especially for like the shoulder brace that I mentioned, they're not great, but there's not a lot of competition. It also might have been made for somebody in a particular case and it just wasn't really able to tackle this one in the same way. So as far as I know, there's not really the same guidelines and rules as far as the actual clothing construction itself, especially around like fastening and that sort of thing, because you get zippers that have like tiny, tiny little pulls that if you just have like fingers as big as mine, you still struggle with, or snaps that require a certain amount of pressure that for somebody might be painful or impossible to undo. That's a really long I don't know.
Yeah, no, I have all sorts of like more questions.
I think like a good way to start, although it might not be the most, the best way, is to even just follow the 7 principles of universal design. As
Sorry to
a
interrupt.
starting point.
Can you speak toward the
yeah.
table? I know you're responding
so
to him,
that
sorry.
you can, at the very minimum, you can at least start at the 7 principles of universal design, where I can't name all of them, but ease of use, aesthetics, and it's, even though it might not be specifically for fashion, it's a good way to guide. Yeah.
That's another question I had actually about universal design in general, that I guess universal design as a concept I've discovered is contentious in some ways, that the idea that the accessibility, at least in a digital context, does not always overlap with what we...
Sorry, coming back.
That
Carry on.
accessibility accommodations are not always universal design. and vice versa. So were there any points where, like, did that come up at all? Like, or does that apply in the same ways? Like, were there any things where you said to yourself, this would be, I guess maybe it's more of a conversation, but like I've noticed this is a trend of people talking about universal design and then also like pushing back on it, and I'm wondering how if that conversation came up at all during the process.
I know it at least came up in some conversations that I was having with folks during the program,
Yeah.
and I expect it came up more than that. One of the things that's really cool about this program and having it just like, no, you are designing for like this person right here, like this
Right.
is, you know, Christopher, or this is April, like you're just designing for this one person, but it's in the context of, you know, somebody's master's degree, or it's in the context of whatever program somebody's going through, which then that experience can apply back in ways that is like, okay, well, somebody might not interact with this the same way. Somebody might not have the same kind of mobility. What if we adapted this design in this specific way in order to just accommodate more people? Like, it doesn't have to affect the aesthetics of it. Like, we could just make this accommodation and make it easier for everybody. So like the classic example of the kitchen gadgets, the OXO gadgets, where it's like, that was made from the start with one person in mind who had arthritis, but ended up being preferred by so many more people because it's like, yeah, it's just easier to grab these things and use it. And like, you know, twist the can opener without hurting your hand as you're doing so, that sort of thing. So I think a lot of the same kinds of things can come out of this, where as you're looking at, you know, a new design that you're working on, or as you're working on the engineering behind something else, you could just say, oh, well, I remember this other thing happened. And you can just kind of like click back in your memory to say, okay, well, there's other kinds of abilities that people have and mobility that they have. We could just design this in a way that'll work for more of them. And so it's not necessarily saying like, you have to design one thing that every single person on the planet can use, but it's more of kind of steering things more into the realm where more people can use it as opposed to fewer.
I think one of the biggest sentiments of Open Style Lab was, at least through our team, and when I
Face table.
what it sounded
Sorry.
like we heard from all of the clients was that they wanted garments that didn't look adaptive. So one quote that Grace says is, if you're designing for people with disabilities, then you're not being inclusive. So I think the takeaway from that was, just because it's adaptive or considers more people, it doesn't mean that the garment's designed specifically for them. It can still be a desirable design for people like you or I, and it doesn't exclude anyone in that shopping experience.
I'd buy that coat that flips around.
Right?
That sounds dope. Yeah.
You should have seen it
Sounds
in
like some
person.
superhero
Like the
shit.
picture does not do it justice.
Absolutely right. Absolutely.
And I'm going back to the jumpsuit that created. We modeled a large part of it off of leggings that Marcy already wears, that she buys at a regular store. And most women do have a pair of leggings that they wear. So the way that she puts it on is no different from the way that we do it. But then the attachment of the top is different and might even be more convenient for me. So it's a more ideal way to put on a jumpsuit for me. And it can get rid of a lot of the things that prevent me from wearing a jumpsuit. So it's nothing about it is really novel to how what we consider an able-bodied person to put on a garment.
Right.
Yeah. I have another question. Sorry, I have so many questions. It's exciting. To the point about engineering, there was like engineering design, a few other disciplines. I'm curious where the engineering fitting is. That like again software engineering, like what is the role of a software engineer, technologist in fashion for people with disabilities and more generally?
So at least for many of the students who are more on the engineering side, I don't know the background of the engineers that were in the summer semester, but I know that in spring and fall, there was a lot of design and technology students, so it wasn't necessarily just software engineering, though you would get people who came in having done nothing except JavaScript. But it was still within a program that's more around like physical computing and design around technology and the use of that to create something whole. So it wasn't just okay, well, you get a programmer in here, welcome, this is a sewing machine. Like, there were certainly some things that were more engineering specific. They had the use of 3D printers and laser cutters and things I had never heard of, kind of to do the physical side of it and making things that just otherwise would just take way too long. Some of the testing and some of the kind of prototyping did involve more programming experience. So like the thing that I showed where they were doing the pressure map. Grace, I don't know if you have examples that get more technical than that. Temperature sensor, DIY.
Yeah, understanding what your body temperature is feeling versus the fabric that's on your body.
Yeah, understanding your body. Oh, why don't you just come over here and talk?
No, it's okay.
Our engineer on our team, we used her ability to animate to take our paper prototypes and essentially communicate and explore the different ways in which our garment could open or close. So that was a way we were able to apply her skill sets to ours.
Would this have even been possible like 10 years ago, given, like you're talking about 3D printers, laser cutters, rapid prototyping, like 15, 20 years ago, like at least 3D printers were like barely a thing, right?
Yeah, but it's
in
also
like an affordable sense.
It's all just down to the tools that are available to you. I mean, this would have been possible in the 30s. They just wouldn't have 3D printed anything.
Right.
I mean, it would have just been the design of the program and kind of how they rolled it out. But the principles and the goals of it don't really matter for how you're putting it together. All right, thanks everybody, and thank you, Grace, for actually making this.
Okay, well, I want to thank you all again for joining us tonight. We have the meetup first Tuesday of each month, and the meetup is going to be announced on meetup.com/A11YNYC. Follow us on Twitter for announcements, and we'll push out the slides. I think you already put them on the meetup group.
Yeah, I responded to the announcement tweet for this. So if you go to the Twitter account for this, A11YNYC, just look for the thread that started off this announcement, and I replied to it with a link to the slides, and the slides link all over the place.
Cool. And yeah, and stick around for, what time is it right now?
8-ish?
Yeah, like stick around we'll be around for another half an hour or so you can hang out, talk, have another drink, and join us next month. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.